Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Drew Heikes. I'm the Director of Business Development for Talos Digital here in Austin. And our goal as a nearshore development company is to really make sure that your startup or product is getting to market quickly with top-tier development resources. So really the goal of today's presentation is to talk about some of the lessons we've learned, some of the pros and cons of different development choices that you might have for your idea, and really to make sure that you're thinking about it correctly. So I'm happy to be joined today by Chad Perry, who is was a co-founder of Clarity Ventures, over 15 years of experience in the field, now is really working at Capital Strategy Labs to help startups and entrepreneurs with any of their IT solutions, any of the kind of ideas that they might have. We also have Sebastian Velez, who's one of our senior developers at Talos Digital. He has over 8 years of experience in the field, really worked with a lot of Fortune 500 companies, and excited to have him. So I'm gonna let these guys get started, but please feel free to interject with any questions along the way. We want to make this really interactive and address any issues that you have along the way. So without further ado, I'll let you guys get going.
Okay. Hello everybody. Drew mentioned my name is Sebastian. I come from Colombia, South America, and really happy to be here in Austin Startup Week. The goal, as Drew mentioned, is to have a very interactive conversation, so please feel free to raise your hand for anything. So what are we gonna address today, or what are we gonna talk about today? So you get a startup, and the scenario is that you need to scale quickly. So you need to find people to code or to leverage some part of your business too. But when you go to the market, you find out that it's not really easy to do it. There is a lot of competition outside, and it's sometimes pretty expensive to do it, right? To hire people to work for your business, especially when you're in a startup. So many years ago, we found out that technology is pretty easy and convenient to leverage work to other people that is in other countries for different reasons, price, talent, etc. And this is where when outsourcing came. However, there are many ways to outsource. And what we would like to discuss today are the different options that you have and some challenges that you face under those different models. So in order to give you some ideas on what we are going to discuss today, basically we're going to split our outsourcing models into three. You can do onshoring or local, which means hiring or transferring work to people or companies that are in your city, which is Austin in this case. You can do nearshoring, which is, let's start first with offshoring, which is basically transfer work to organizations that is in another part of the world for different reasons, as I mentioned, and some countries became very popular in this, India, Asia in general, Eastern Europe, etc., etc. And there is like a third model that is kind of in the middle, which is called nearshoring, which is transferring work to people or organizations that are under your same region. So for the case of the US, that can be Canada, Mexico, or well, Latin America in general. Or if you are in Europe, it will be something like Eastern Europe or companies that are close to you, right? We're gonna address those, we're gonna discuss those different types of outsourcing and the challenges that they face under. We're dividing them in three general categories. The first one and most important one is communication and how you deal in a startup with your vendor and how you manage the channels of communication and how to make sure that they are really like an extension of your team and your vision is aligned. We're going to discuss issues related to contracts, requirements, and how you handle those. And in the day-to-day, we're going to discuss some issues related to the scope that you may have and how to deal with them. Those topics are influenced by different factors, especially when you are coming from local, perhaps you don't feel them, but when you start going to other countries or to other cultures, you face some issues related first of big health of cultural issues or cultural barriers that you may find. time zone issues that sometimes makes communication more difficult to deal with. And third, it's really important to take in mind what having a startup means. When you have a startup, this is pretty different to having a traditional company. And when you go offshoring, when you go nearshoring, there are some topics that we would like to solve on what we think is important to do, or the challenges that you need to be prepared for, especially because the characteristic of a startup. Okay? So let's start talking about what having a startup means. A startup is pretty different than a traditional company. First, it's more iterative and exploratory. You are basically all the time facing the unknown. When you deal with a startup, you have like an initial vision, but it's pretty important that you are able to quickly move according to the feedback that you are gathering when you build it. And the concept of lean software development, agile methodologies, and the main concept of how a startup should be handled is that you need to be able to quickly gather feedback and to move based on that. The issue here, and why this is important, is because this is pretty different, and it's kind of like the opposite of what a traditional dev shops are expecting. Because a traditional development company is expecting something fixed, clear, and that they can use to create an architecture and something from the technical point of view that they are handling. If we don't address, or if we don't align with the vendor company, the fact that we need to be prepared to move quickly, this is going to cause some problems because of the main nature of a startup. In a startup, we don't have 1 year iterations. We don't have 1 year to go to the market. We need to be going like very, very quickly and periodically making enhancements. And based on that, we need to make changes. And this is going to change the way in that we interact with our vendor company differently than how business were done like many years ago, or what the traditional methodologies of software development push us for.
Yeah, I would just ask, is everybody familiar with what we're talking about when we say lean development or agile? You guys heard about that? The basic idea is that back in the day, before the internet, software was built in really large releases and then shipped out on physical media. Now with the internet, now that we can deliver software immediately to all users in real time, then we're able to release on a much compressed schedule, like say a week at a time or a day at a time, or even sometimes a couple of hours at a time, we're able to get releases out the door. And so that's the difference that Sebastian is describing between a large company which has well-defined products and well-defined vision around the products versus a startup that's able to move quickly, figure out what needs to be done, and then react to feedback it gets from the market.
All clear there? So let's talk about communication. The first topic that we would like to discuss is that it's really important when you deal with a vendor that you share the vision of your product with them, especially in a startup, because in any startup, even if you are developing local, it's really advisable that the first user of your application are your team members, and they are trying the application and they are caring about what they are doing for the value that it will have for their lives or for the market, etc., and not just because they were assigned to a development task to make. That sense of caring, of creating a winner software instead of just caring about finishing what my user story or my use case says that I should do, is something that is not easy or immediate to transfer to your vendor, but requires some work. On aligning or telling them, and I'm talking about telling to the complete team that generally that's something very, very good, not only like to the product owner or project manager from the vendor side, like what you're talking about, the challenges that you may face, the reason for this product for existing, and why is it going to be like innovative, or what's the differentiator from the competition. If you have the feeling and you can transfer that vision to your vendor, you're going to have first faster feedback of your product, because they start from the development cycle and not when somebody externally is trying to test what you're doing. Second, your team gets to really care about details, and that's something that is one of the major pitfalls of the most common problems when you deal with vendors. You need to start specifying every single detail, and they return to you something and you see it and you say, no, this is not how we are gonna win in the market. And you need to transfer with more work, with more in detail instruction or something, your process becomes more inefficient. But if you take the time at the beginning to start transferring your vision, and you constantly deal with your development team, specifying how to do that, on why this product is going to be really good, you're going to get a much more efficient process and a faster feedback. In general, yes.
Yeah, I would add, the reason that communication is so foundational and so critical to, especially in a startup, because when you're building a product, especially a product that doesn't exist, you're asking a developer or a software programmer to take something that you just described in words and to tell a computer, which requires exact machine level instructions. You're translating that from our human language into something really exact. And so that's never a perfect process. You never perfectly have your requirements defined. So a programmer's job is not only to build what you want and write the code. A programmer's job is also to translate what you're asking for into features and into a working product that not only aligns with what you're asking for, but that may include things that you didn't think about, or things that are only relevant when you start considering them in a context of what's possible with development. So if you want to do this, or know that's going to take more time, you should do this instead. And so that communication loop that you have with your developers is very critical. You want to make sure that is that you have very close communication with your developers so that you can get that feedback loop in.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention as well that this comes. So we started in software development many years ago with waterfall approaches. Now, or the tendency, especially for startups, is becoming to move to more kind of agile sort of methodologies. And those agile methodologies for software development try to encourage more the real-time communication instead of previous documentation to be specified with every single detail, right? Why do you do that? Especially because it's a more kind of efficient way than creating a 200 pages document at the beginning of your project, if you are going to find out in the middle that a lot of things needs to change. So when you come into lean development and startup and agile methodologies, you realize that you create a certain level of documentation, but you rely a lot into the face-to-face or real-time communication in order to specify details during the way of the project. In that way, a developer is going to find out many gaps, or is going to find some topics to be discussed. No matter how much you try to make those gaps be resolved, if you want to be really lean on it, the questions will arise and feedback will arise that will require some changes. So it's really important that you build that communication channel with your team. And we're talking about with developers.
Yeah, right? That's true for all. I mean, that's true for onshoring, nearshoring, offshoring. It's just a given that in a startup, you need to have close communication.
The main deal when we start discussing the difference between onshoring, nearshoring, and offshoring this topic is that the more that you get far from where you are, you start seeing some challenges. So for example, when you do offshoring, you have to deal with something that is the time zone. And that's really important that you should take in mind. If we're saying that communication is really important, but your team is sleeping when the other team is working, this makes communication a little more difficult. It is possible to do it. And we are not going to say, I mean, every single outsourcing model, if you do it like right, or if you take in mind some challenges, it can be very successful for you. With offshoring, however, you need to deal first, with the fact that communication is more problematic. I worked for a company in India for a year, from India, and also from the States. I was working with them, but from America. And the main point is, I had to have meetings very early in the morning or very late in the evening in order to be able to work with them. And when there was, I remember that I had this deadline, and I had to be like 1 month working from midnight to 8 a.m. in the morning in order to be able to really interact with the development team, because we were doing a lot of migrations, etc., etc. This is something that can be a little bit more problematic. What can be advisable there is to, in those cases, is to have somebody on client side that you can trust and that you can transfer first your vision, and second that you can empower in order for him or her to take some decisions when the team remote is working on the other side of the world. If you can create, or if you can trust that person, or you can grow that person to be able to represent yourself on client side, this reduces the risk, or this would make you become your process a little bit smoother. But if you cannot do that, you are going to face many issues related to time zone, and that's something that is basically more important the more distance that you have from your development team. When you do onshoring, let's say that you are developing in Colombia. That's where I'm coming from. So you do have to face with some remote communication stuff. But first, you are on the same time zone, which is a big advantage of doing a nearshoring, is that your team is awake when you are awake. Second, it's really important that if your nearshoring company make developers accessible in terms of language and in terms of some soft skills of proactivity, of being able to speak. If they are able to do that, it's going to be really good for you, because you can basically have a process like if they are in the same place that you are. I mean, you are on Skype all day and you can talk with them all the time. Many problems that can come with these models is, for example, language kind of problems. If only your project manager on the vendor side is able to speak English well, and you cannot contact directly to your development team, that's again the same kind of issues. What you're going to find out is that your process becomes much slower, and there are some gaps of the communication if you have to go through different levels.
Yeah, I mean, these things are essentially on a spectrum. So you've got onshore, you've got nearshore, you've got offshore. And if you think about how you're communicating with your team, if your team is local, or especially if it's internal, then you can have these everyday water cooler conversations. You can have a lot of interactivity. But the farther you get away, literally, physically, and geographically, the harder it becomes to do that. And with nearshoring, you're on the same time zone. You still have maybe a little bit of a cultural difference, but you can have very good English-speaking teams that are pretty closely aligned with Western culture, and you're on the same time zone. Exactly, in this case, Colombia is on our time zone. And then when you go to offshoring, of course, you have to deal with the time zone offset. And the greater that time zone offset, like India, I believe, or I don't know what they are, but I think Singapore somewhere around there is 12 hours. So you get to the point where you're totally offset, which can be an advantage if you have a team working here and a team working there. But you have to have somebody, either you or somebody that you trust, that's able to facilitate that communication. And a lot of times it also leads to delays in development. So let's say you have a small request. It's just a small thing. If you had an internal team, then you can make that update in 15 minutes if they were there on site or on the same time zone. But a team offshore halfway around the world won't get your request until they wake up in 12 hours, and then you're asleep by that time, and then you get the output of that request the next day. So sometimes that can cause the timeline of development to extend beyond the initial benefits of maybe the cost savings.
Any comment or question that you would like to?
Yeah, how many of you in here have experience with offshore, like India, Europe, anywhere? Okay. How many of you would say it was a largely positive experience? Okay, so it seems like the majority of you have had some sort of issues, and maybe that's the reason that you're here. So if you have any specific questions around that, feel free to ask.
Or is there any other like advice or comment from the people that has a positive experience that you would like to raise up, like mentioned, besides what we have discussed, or do you agree with them?
I would just say it's real important that the folks that are here buy into offshore. There's some stereotyping, some negative stuff around it, but the success that I had is because people were really excited about the opportunity. They saw the benefit of it and helping them out.
Yeah.
If that's not there, if it's negative, if that was the biggest obstacle I ever had was folks on this side of the ocean's attitude towards it.
Yeah, I've experienced that too. And I'll talk a little bit later about a positive example that I had with when we talk about scoping, but it can definitely be a successful experience if you align your expectations accordingly and you set up your team properly. Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is I think development talent is everywhere, but project management talent is rare. So in my experience, like just a couple of data points, Eastern Europe, they have good project managers. They're able to like, take what we use in say and understand it. Whereas in India, it's not as good. And so you really have to handhold a lot more. And so in that case, it's better to have someone on the ground in India, for my example.
Yeah, and that ties into scope, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But I guess the bottom line really is that anytime you're dealing with a different team, whether it's local, nearshore, offshore, anytime you've got any kind of differences there, you have to have somebody who can be a liaison to that culture or to that time zone. If you don't have somebody that can translate your vision, whether it's you, whether you have the experience to translate that vision for developers, or you have somebody on the development side who's able to take your vision, then that's when you really start to have problems. And that's what a startup is all about, is you've got a vision, and that's really all it is. You're trying to figure out the how. You don't know the how, but you know in general what you want. And a developer, in order to translate that vision into a product, has to have the creativity and the cultural context and the awareness of all of that together so that they can interpret your vision and build a product that aligns with it. And that's where a lot of people run into problems, is they get something that they've asked for, but what they asked for wasn't really what they needed, or it wasn't well defined, and you've got developers over in a different time zone that had to fill in the gaps.
One advice that I think has been very successful for us is to, especially when you are offshoring, is to implement some kind of daily meetings that agile methodologies recommend in order to quickly get feedback. You need to be able, especially when you are overseas, to be able to have constant feedback from your team and a constant understanding of where they are stuck or what problem they are facing. For that, there are many methodologies out there, especially there is one that's very popular that's called Scrum that suggests weekly daily meeting, 15 minutes, just asking what did you do yesterday, what are you gonna do today, what problems have you found during the day, or what kind of problem do you have. I like asking for one that has been very useful for us, that is, what's your confidence level from 1 to 10 to deliver on time? And if you keep asking that day to day, there are many topics that can be discussed related to that, because we don't want to make it a long conversation. There are different ways to make it like short, but if you do that, that's very useful for understanding any issue that the developers may have. And when it comes to nearshoring or offshoring, this becomes really, really important. And that's something that we really encourage every single company to try to make. Something short that you can keep on time, but that gives you more confidence on your progress of your development team. Okay. So the second type of topics or challenges that we want to discuss is related to estimations and the different type of contracts that we may have with our vendors. So the bottom line is estimations are really important, and we all want to make it, and it's really useful for our business in order to understand like the order of magnitude of my development, and in order to go to an investor, etc. You need to have those. That being said, it's also important that in order to have that, you don't lose kind of like flexibility. That is what you may experience when you go on fixed bid contracts. If you go on fixed bid contracts, that what happens is that you basically need to have a very clear scope at the beginning, and you are basically fixed with that scope and with that without having the opportunity to take any action in the middle. So when it comes to this kind of projects, first of all, the contract affects the software methodology that you can use. And that's something that we have experienced. I have been on the vendor side and the client side for many years, and we have seen that when fixed contracts appear and when you have a fixed amount of money and a fixed scope, you cannot be first that iterative or that kind of like feedback oriented that you are when you have certain degree of flexibility. You cannot basically be proactive from your development team, especially if they are like external to like overseas or external to your team. You cannot be that proactive to ask suggestions or to change the stuff because, hey, no, this is what we commit to, and you need to negotiate with the vendor every single change that you're gonna make because that's out of the proposed scope. So at the end, as Chad was mentioning, if you fix too much what you're gonna do and you have a fixed scope, you finish having the product that you asked for, but probably that's not gonna be the product that you needed or the product that really you discovered that was important for your business. That being said, what we would recommend here is, hey, estimation, you can estimate and there are different ways to estimate, but don't rely into a way that don't allow you to be flexible on single details and for that, losing the opportunity to be more effective in your entry to the market or be more aligned to what your feedback is being. Yes.
Yeah, and I would add to that the way this really comes into play with how you decide whether you're nearshore or offshore or even onshore is that, in my experience, offshoring is really beneficial and can be really successful when you have very well-defined requirements. And I think this goes back to the communication issue and the time zone and the culture. A lot of times when you deal with an offshore company, you don't really have access to the developers. You have some sort of intermediary that you're talking to, and ideally this intermediary, as we were talking about earlier, needs to be able to plug into your product vision. And so on the offshoring part of it, that can be very successful if you have your requirements very well defined, which does seem to lend itself toward fixed bid projects. But again, you go back to the nature of a startup, and it's kind of counter to the nature of a startup to say, well, hey, here's all the things that we're going to build. Let's just go build it in one go. And I think probably everybody in this room has had some sort of experience where you change your mind about what you want your product to do, or maybe your entire business changes, and then you have to deal with change requirements or change requests that you were mentioning. And so it can very quickly run into a bad situation. So you want your development company to be able to respond quickly to your changes. And one of the ways that you can do that and manage your cost effectively is by choosing a development methodology like Lean or Agile and choosing a development company that's responsive to that can scope appropriately and set budgets on a small incremental scale.
And you can get a good ballpark out of it. You can say, if we stay within this scope, here's what said costs are going to be. But having the flexibility to play around that is very important.
Yeah, at the end of the day, when a developer tells you, I've been on both sides of the fence. I've written software for 18 years. So at the end of the day, a software developer really can't tell you with perfect accuracy how long a specific task is going to take. They can get really close, they can get better at it, especially as if they've seen what your project is, if they've done it before. But the only way to really truly control costs is to drive it from your end by setting the requirements and setting the expectations. And you can do that by setting it in such small increments that you have the opportunity to respond to any kind of misalignment in your estimate, or let's say your budget or your estimate was just totally off, and it turns out that this one feature is going to take way longer. Well, then you can prioritize that feature against its value in terms of the overall vision, and you have the opportunity to respond to that. And I think the point here is that fixed bid contracts are kind of counter to that flow. So you want to be careful that you align your expectations with your development company's methodology.
So when it comes to estimations, there are different ways that you can get an estimate on any development that you can do. What we have found is that you can go on two different sides, or one is more in the middle. One side is to go fixed bid, right, and to say, give me an exact amount that this is going to cost me. And when you do that, you need to start defining a lot more specifically requirements, scenarios, etc., and with the issue that we just discussed. The other option that a lot of companies do is give me a very high-level estimation, right, which is basically a range, but this gives you an idea. The idea is going to be more accurate as far as requirements are more well-defined, but still, since we don't want to go into defining every single detail, you can go into a range, right? And you can move from that. Or there are certain cases when, especially when you have dependency on devices or technical risks that you need to understand better before really giving an accurate estimation. You go a model in the middle, that is where you have first a certain amount of time. I'm talking about 1 to 2 weeks. Well, I don't know, a small amount of time where you can do some architecture checks or proof of concepts on devices or big unknowns that you have in order to resolve those gaps that you can see in order to have a better estimation. If you have a lot of those kind of challenges or unknown areas, perhaps you want to go on that model in order to be able to more accurately define what your established or what your estimation is looking like. In that way, you can get something that can give you confidence, but as we were saying, it's important that you can keep some flexibility and that you are able to manage your budget iteration by iteration, right? This brings us to the topic of scope. So under these methodologies that we are discussing, the best way, and that's what lean development proposes as well, is you define your tasks in order of priority for your business, right? So you have something that is called a backlog, that is basically a list of tasks that needs to be done in your project, but you always keep in the top your most priority, the top priority task for you. And you start developing those. And you can handle the scope by going iteration by iteration in that way, and at the end or in the middle, you should be able to already have the most important task for your business done. What does this mean? And this is very advisable for a startup. You should be able to do some hacks, tricks, mocks, whatever you want to call it, for topics that are not specific for your business. So if you are developing a company, I don't know, like Uber, and what's important for you? Focusing on routes, getting a car, doing, I don't know, billing, etc. The most important or the most critical feature for your business. Administrator management, for example. That's something that perhaps at the beginning you can have 2-3 administrators in the database, like over there, you cannot edit them, you cannot add new without going to the database and inserting them manually, but you don't want to go into a sophisticated UI until you first focus on what's critical for your business. If you constantly prioritize thinking on that way that you can go with short-term solutions for what's not critical until you deliver what really is going to make you successful on the business. You can rely into these methodologies and constantly prioritize and see value quickly, and see your startup working pretty quickly. And when is a development done? When you see, hey, no, this was enough, right? You see the backlog and you see the tasks that are missing, perhaps, or okay, you can do it in one go, but perhaps if you're running out of budget in just one possible scenario, you can say, no, I mean, the tasks that are missing, I really don't need them, or I really can do it from now. And at the end, you build a product that is focused on your main features for being successful in the market.
Yeah, and I'd say this is where nearshoring really shines, and it's certainly my favorite development approach. I've used offshore, I've run an onshore development company just down the road here, and recently, a couple of years ago, I started working with nearshore developers, and I found that the main benefit of working with nearshore is that you can treat them like your own team. They're on the same time zone. There's very little communication. No, there's no communication barrier. There's very little cultural barrier, and the cost advantage is pretty significant when you consider that you can get on the phone just the same as you would with a developer here in town, just on Skype, and you can walk through every morning what you need to work on and figure out what your priority is, so that you, as the owner of your product vision, can drive that, like what we were talking about with scope and with contract, as if it were your own internal team. I've seen this work very successfully in multiple instances, and I know Talos, they obviously, they're growing like crazy and have a great reputation. So I don't see why really this isn't talked about more often.
So what is a good way to evaluate how comfortable a given nearshore or offshore development company is with this agile methodology? Is it just asking them about it, asking questions? It sounds like it's a really critical part of getting iterative design done.
Yeah, and maybe you guys can talk a little bit about the process of dealing with clients.
What I can tell you as a general advice is that, well, at least when I started in my industry, selecting vendors rely a lot more into, hey, give me a document with your process. So how do you manage quality? So give me a document that I can read of your processes. And the main problem of that is that this becomes on any vendor, being good or being bad, can write something good. You know what I mean? I mean, you can go into books, you can get the general understanding, you can list the issues, etc. This doesn't mean at any point that they are going to be good when you really start working with them, right? So it's really important that you take the time to talk with them, to understand how they do it. Even sometimes clients prefer to give like a small prototype at the beginning to evaluate how a vendor is going before having a very long-term commitment, because this gives you the ability, even if it's just like talking and having a conversation, going to the offices and seeing how things are going there. But if you take the time to evaluate them, your processes in reality, this gives you a more accurate way of evaluating than relying into documentation or something very generic.
Can you talk a little bit more about maybe what you guys do as a vendor to make sure that you align with culture and language?
Yeah, so in general, I have been working from Colombia for many years and from other Latin American countries, and it's not easy, or it's something that requires work to make cultural barriers to be reduced, hopefully to zero. And this comes as well with language and some soft skills that we have discussed here. So there are different topics that we as vendors have been trying to use for years, and I can say that we successfully done it. And is first, your team needs to be 100% bilingual, and that needs to be able to speak to every single developer. And that's something that that's another advice when you are dealing with selecting a vendor, is that you can only rely to a project manager that can speak English. That's gonna make your project very inefficient. So we make sure that every single person speaks English well and can communicate, because communication is not only the ability to speak a language, it's also the ability to raise concerns quickly, to understand that they should be proactive about asking questions, about filling the gaps together with the client. And that kind of topics is something that you need to build in your vendor company culture. And it's one of the topics that I really encourage you to take a look at when defining vendors.
Yeah, I'd say another unspoken point here is that you want to make sure that you have access to the actual developers who are writing your code. And that's a huge difference I've found between a lot of offshore companies and the nearshore companies. You're able to, when you're in the same time zone and in the same region, you're able to have access to your developers. Now, you still may have a layer or two of project management. If you don't have that in-house, you certainly want that on the side of the development company. But another advantage of being in the same region is that, Colombia is just a 3-hour flight. Not only that, Colombians can be in the United States for up to 6 months, and I believe it's the same with a lot of other South American and Central American countries. So you literally have direct access to your developers, and they can come on site and work with you as much as needed.
So one of the ways we've been working with a lot of the capital factory companies is that developer will come on site and work next to you right from the start. So this is who I'm working with, this is a part of my team, and they're able to come and go as needed, as Travis mentioned.
Yeah, and I've actually worked with these guys in that capacity, and it's been phenomenal. I would definitely recommend it.
So what's the cost difference? How much more expensive is it nearshoring in terms of comparing it to offshore?
It's usually about a third of the price that you'd find hiring someone locally here in Austin.
Okay, but as far as like comparing it to the offshoring, is it like 20% more, would you say?
I don't know if I can speak to the differences of offshoring versus nearshoring in the cost sense.
It depends on where as well.
Yeah, it also depends on where, but another point to make is that in the beginning of my career, when I started a development company out of college, we worked with a lot of entrepreneurs, and we eventually stopped working with entrepreneurs intentionally because it was so difficult, because they came in with expectations of a certain budget. A lot of times entrepreneurs are spending their life savings on their vision, and there's an expectation that needs to be set. So cost is a huge driver, but cost is, financial cost is not the only cost, right? There's the cost of dealing with mistakes. And what I found is that it can be much costlier to deal with offshore. For example, I've seen, I would say, you could probably get developers for 10, 14 bucks an hour, or maybe even less, in places like Eastern Europe and India. And that sounds really attractive if, and this is a big if it meets the criteria of being able to communicate and support what you need as a startup. So that's definitely a consideration to make. And then in terms of the cost of nearshore, I'd say that's about accurate, a third of the cost. I really hesitate to throw out numbers here, but I think a developer here might cost 120 grand a year, somewhere around there. Maybe a really good one might cost upwards of 150 if you need like CTO level talent. And I've seen that kind of talent come out of Costa Rica and Colombia at a third of the cost, or actually less.
Other than the cost, what else could make offshoring options more attractive than nearshoring? If you want to just compare them, because I'm mostly hearing that nearshoring seems to be a better option. Just want to know if there is anything that makes offshoring more attractive versus depending on different cases.
Aside from cost, I would say cost is definitely the biggest one. If you're going to have, if cost savings are equal, I would much prefer to work with somebody locally, just because I'm biased to be able to have those conversations every day. In general, offshoring I've seen work extremely well, be very effective when there was, in our case, the company that I was working with had a certified project manager with a technical background local to the office where we were in Dallas. And she was, I mean, her entire job every day she spent making detailed requirements and instructions for the offshore team. So if you have a project that is really well defined, or you're able to take your project and break it into really small tasks, I would say go for it if you can, if you have a reputable company.
I used to work with banking systems when I was in India, and I can say that in that kind of projects, that as Charles mentioned, you cannot go that lean in a banking software development, right? You need to be much more specific, and that mitigates a lot of the risk for offshoring and making a really good option for what we just said, right? I can say that some places it's easy to expand to 500 team members offshore than it can be in other places, right? So those are kind of some options, but it comes more for big corporation, detail-specific kind of development where you have every single detail related.
I would say as a startup though, you should definitely consider offshoring for things like prototypes, especially if it's something that's, you just may have a big question mark around how something is going to work. You could, if you can define your requirements from a business perspective, okay, this is what I need to prove, whatever concept we're trying to prove, and understand that that prototype is probably going to be throwaway, then I would definitely consider offshore. If the prototype is something that is going to grow into a full production system, you might not get the same benefits because at some point you want to transition over to a team that's more suitable, and that transition can actually be very costly if you have a pile of code that nobody knows how it works and you're trying to give it to another dev shop. That cost of switching can be pretty high.
I think one other consideration where it could work well is if there's defined tasks, especially if you do a lot of testing in the development process, so that you could actually do like 3 deliverables in a period of time, transfer back and forth between time zones, if it's well defined, like you said. And then I think the other one that's a huge consideration, the other side is intellectual property is a reason that goes along with your nice matrix.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's the last point up here, so thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Yeah, so these are, I mean, I hate to even talk about these because they're kind of remote, but, well, the second one is, but the biggest risk you have anytime you outsource to anybody is a dependency risk, which is when you get dependent on this dev shop where it becomes a black box and you have no idea how they built your product, you have no idea how they solved your problem, and your cost of switching, as we mentioned, is going to be extremely high, or it can be. So you definitely want to be careful about who you're asking. Essentially, this person, this dev shop is going to be your partner, right? Whether you like it or not. So if you're treating them like you can just farm off some work, then that approach is not going to be very beneficial to you in the end. So you want to make sure you avoid dependencies by having a good, deep relationship with your vendor. And I found that that's easier nearshoring. It's easiest when you have somebody local down the street, but most, in fact, all nearshore companies that I've worked with have domestic entities that can be held accountable for things like your second risk, which would be intellectual property loss. The last thing you want is somebody to solve a problem for you. You pay them, they disappear. You've got a competitor site that pops up out of Eastern Europe somewhere, and there's no recourse because they're in a jurisdiction outside of your control. So make sure that whoever you're dealing with has an entity in a jurisdiction that's local to you or that respects intellectual property, and also has a track record that you can point to and say, okay, well, yeah, they have a good reason not to run away. Anything else?
I'm learning.
Yeah, is there any other questions around that? Kind of ran through that pretty quickly.
So you guys brought up establishing cultural fit a few times. Do you guys have any suggestions for navigating cultural touch points or identifying when your issue is a cultural one rather than one of technical miscomprehension?
Sebastian?
I think in general, if you find out that something was known from before, I mean, most of the cultural issues that I have found are related on being able to interact on time and efficiently about any problem that may come, right? So if something is failing because the system in general was designed with a problem, that's something technical. But if something should have been able to be resolved before, but you only realize until that moment, or you realize that there is like a miscommunication or misunderstanding of something, but the original intention was good and failed because of other kind of issues, you can realize that there is a problem of cultural barriers, etc. And again, this is not only time zone or language, it's also because it's important, especially when you go to other cultures, to promote the ability to be a partner, as Chad mentioned. And there is a certain degree of cultural issues related to, hey, I can be raised in a way that when somebody gives me an order, a task to done, I should just don't ask, just do it. And that's something very dangerous for your business. So that's something that is culturally needs to be promoted, that you should be able to be proactive, and it's okay to raise concerns, and it's good to raise concerns because from your side, you're a developer, you're seeing things that perhaps the other people haven't seen. And that's something that requires some work.
Yeah, a more specific way of dealing with that might be to just maybe do some background research on whatever culture that you're offshoring to. So I know that I think I read an article a while back around maybe it was the South Korean culture, where there was this cultural tendency of people not to question their superiors. And in a development context, that is completely the opposite of what you want. You want a developer to exercise as much creativity as they need to address whatever you're trying to build.
So,
this might be outside the scope of the discussion, so that's fine. Maybe take it whichever direction you want. But when you are engaged, or when you are an engaging party for like a nearshoring or offshoring arrangement, what's the, I guess, ideal documentation that you receive, or the process you go by to define the scope of the project? Is that wireframes? Is that an SRS document? Do you never ever get those, and so you kind of have a brainstorming meeting and etc.?
I want to speak to that.
I mean, every case can be different, but there are some general recommendations that we may have. Wireframes are really, really important. So because if you don't have even wireframes, you only have like a high-level ideas that can be translated into many different ways. So there is a certain degree of specifications that we encourage to make, and wireframes, I mean, doesn't have to be like the perfectly pixel diagrams or wireframes, but at least certain degree of understanding physically how everything should look like, right? Mm-hmm. This is not only because of the specification, but also by the general understanding among your team. You can create even complete prototypes based on wireframes and even validate them with the market. That's a separate discussion, but this is very useful. Having wireframes really helps you. Going until the level of SRS is kind of like, for some specific tasks that have very complex technical issues, is really advisable. For other ones that you can rely to wireframes and communication, like real-time communication, I would say is enough. That's my opinion on it, and I don't know if you guys have to, I think we will agree with this, but something very challenging perhaps requires a SRS, mm-hmm. but I think wireframe should be like in every single effort that you want.
Yeah, I mean, think about, so that's a really good point. Wireframes even of the entire vision that you have in your head as it stands, which will obviously change in a startup. It's not so important that they're accurate and they define what the ultimate product will be. They're more beneficial from a developer's perspective to understand the context of why you're doing something. So don't just build a screen. A developer says, don't just build a screen and click on a button. I need to know why that button is going to be clicked on. Maybe there's another button that does something similar. Maybe there's some dots that I need to connect there. And maybe there's something that I need to suggest that we can do to save time. Or even in some cases, maybe you can find something off the shelf and maybe hobble something together and reduce your development costs.
And if that's not something that you have ready to go, we can provide the design and architecture needed to get to that phase. So
yeah, that's something that should definitely be built into any kind of vendor that you're talking to. If they're asking you to do something that you don't know how to do, then obviously that's not good.
How do you go about, I mean, what would you advise finding a good vendor? I mean, is there like a premier marketplace that you would go looking for these people, or just basic researching on the internet, or where do y'all find them?
No, I mean, I'm a real fan of nearshoring. Again, I think there are differences that are going very well. I would recommend, with Talos, I think you find really good options related to price and methodologies and like the culture of the people as well, so perhaps it's a good option to take a look at. But in general, I think nearshoring has good points to evaluate.
Yeah, word of mouth, I think, I tend to be skeptical of somebody I find on the internet who is located halfway around the world, because all you really need to know how to do is be good at SEO to get your rankings up and make yourself appear credible. Whereas if you can go through a network like Capital Factory is a perfect example, where people have used them, they have a local track record, and definitely go that way.
Yeah. So it's,
No, when you're done.
I was going to change the topic, so.
So I'm Kate Brent from IBM, and we're sponsoring this track. And when we also have a complementary program to what you guys are doing, which is essentially a startup program offering cloud credits, and it's really go as fast as you can, wherever your developers are, and communication back and forth with systems that are local. So I'm delighted you guys are part of this track. It's really cool.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
I think we're about out of time.
Yeah, I know. Just wanted to comment in 1 minute. What are we doing in Talos? What we have learned that we should do from the vendor side, especially from a country like where I'm from, in Colombia. First, we are, as I mentioned, improving communication skills of the team, making sure that every single person is 100% bilingual. Second, it's important that we train the team or the vendor. We learn that it's really important that they know how a startup should be, and that they are aware of the methodologies based on the concept of what a startup is. We really also love hiring entrepreneurs, so people that have experience creating software before, and sending the team on site very often is very important. Here in Capital Factory, we're based, we are sending developers all the time. So you really feel that they are part of the American culture, and they don't have that difference when you deal with developers. And well, we're very well established here in the US, the offices here in the US, and there is a domestic entity in order to give confidence on the risk that we just mentioned. So those are some of the topics. We create trainings on UX, kind of that kind of stuff. So we make sure that the people, and this is really important, that the people that you find really cares for your product, and that the product is going to be usable and nice. And it's not only, hey, I got this task, I'm going to deliver, and I don't care what else is going to be with your product. So those are some of the topics we like working on, what we have been working on for years.
Yep, and I would say that goes for any development company that you use, onshore, local at Austin, nearshore, offshore. Just make sure that you feel comfortable with how they work in alignment with how you need to be working as a startup. Any other questions?
Thanks for your time, guys. Please come talk to us.